A locked gate. A vanished secret. Nothing adds up. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in today. Hearing from you makes this journey unforgettable. Now, let's begin. The yaw. Morning had begun with a drizzle, one of those fine Parisian rains that seemed less to fall than to hover in the air, clinging to overcoats and moustaches, settling on the brim of hats. Chief Inspector Maigret stood at the window of his office, pipe in hand, staring at the blurred silhouettes of passers-by on the boulevard Richard Lenoir. The glass was beaded with moisture, distorting the figures so that each became just a shape, hurried, indifferent, wrapped in their own concerns. He was not at that moment occupied with any pressing case. The bureau was oddly quiet, as if the drizzle itself had softened the usual bustle. Maigret felt the pleasant heaviness that came with such days, a heaviness that invited patience rather than action. He tamped the bowl of his pipe with his thumb, relit it, and allowed the blue smoke to curl slowly toward the ceiling. Madame Maigret had sent him off that morning with her usual calm efficiency. She had looked up from her sewing as he put on his hat, remarking only, "You'll need your heavier coat. The dampness settles in the bones." It was the sort of observation that stayed with him, not for its accuracy, but for the quiet way she saw things. Often, he reflected, her words returned later in unexpected ways. On his desk lay a small stack of reports, nothing urgent. A petty theft in Montmartre, a quarrel in a market that had turned into a scuffle, a suspicious death of an elderly man that the medical examiner had already labeled natural. He had glanced at them without interest, and yet, as so often, a detail lingered, not from the reports but from the telephone call he had received shortly after arriving. A woman's voice, hesitant, almost apologetic, had asked if she might speak with him privately. She had given her name, Madame Vernou, and an address in the quiet quarter near Parc Montsouris. There had been something in her tone, not urgent, not dramatic, but tremulous. She had said only, "It is perhaps nothing, Monsieur le Commissaire, yet it troubles me." Then, almost as if embarrassed by her own boldness, she had hung up. Maigret had not moved immediately. He had sat with the receiver still in his hand, pipe smoke curling upward, listening to the faint hum of the line after she was gone. A woman. Troubled by something vague. It was hardly grounds for official concern. And yet, he turned back toward the window. Outside, a man struggled with an umbrella that the wind had turned inside out. The umbrella's ribs jutted like broken bones. The man cursed under his breath and life went on. Maigret felt the small stirring in his chest, the sense that the day was about to draw him elsewhere, into some quiet corner of Paris where people lived in their ordinary ways, carrying their secrets as naturally as their groceries. He took his hat from the peg, buttoned his coat against the drizzle, and told young Lapointe, who had just arrived with a sheaf of papers, "I'll be out for a while. Don't expect me before lunch." Lapointe nodded without question. By now he understood that such departures of the chief inspector were rarely random, even if they seemed so. When Maigret stepped outside, the drizzle greeted him like a familiar companion. He turned up his collar, felt the dampness creep in, and began walking toward the nearest cab stand. The address Madame Vernou had given was lodged in his mind. He had no official reason to go. But that was not the way of things. Some doors, once knocked upon, opened not to evidence or confessions but to silences, evasions, glances, and in those silences lay the truth. The mystery, if there was one, had not yet begun. But already Maigret felt the faint unease that told him it was waiting. The cab took him south, away from the busy arteries of the city, into narrower streets where the drizzle seemed to linger heavier between the facades. The windows of the small cafes were fogged, their interiors glowing faintly yellow in the late morning. Maigret leaned back in the worn leather seat, pipe between his teeth, and let the rhythm of the ride settle into his bones. He was in no hurry. He seldom was. A police inspector who rushed only frightened away the truth. The driver let him out near the edge of Parc Montsouris, where the chestnut trees dripped steadily and their roots pressed unevenly against the pavement. The houses here were modest, many with small front gardens enclosed by iron gates. The drizzle darkened the stone walls and soaked the hedges until they glistened, heavy with water. It was a quiet quarter, respectable, not wealthy, but with the sort of reticence that hid itself from the city's harsher noises. Number 18 was easy enough to find. A narrow house with pale shutters closed against the damp, its façade plain, perhaps even a little neglected. The garden in front was no more than a strip of earth with 2 lilac bushes and a gravel path. Yet Maigret noticed, with the same casual attention he might give to a man's shoes, that the small iron gate was locked. Not simply closed, but fastened with a brass padlock that looked newer than the rusted hinge it hung upon. He stood a moment on the pavement, pipe in hand, staring at it. A locked gate for so small a garden seemed unusual. More unusual still was that the gravel within had no footprints. The rain should have left prints if anyone had passed recently, but the surface was undisturbed, as though no one had walked there for days. Maigret pressed the bell. He heard its faint tremor inside. After a delay, steps approached, and the door opened to reveal a woman of about 50, carefully dressed though her cardigan was buttoned unevenly. Her hair was arranged with precision, though a strand had come loose and clung to her cheek from the damp. Her expression, even before she spoke, carried the same tremulous hesitation that Maigret had heard over the telephone. "Monsieur le commissaire?" she asked, though it was not truly a question. He inclined his head, removed his hat, and stepped inside as she moved aside. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and damp wool. A narrow staircase rose steeply, the banister worn smooth by years of use. He could hear the distant hum of a radio from somewhere upstairs, a woman's voice speaking slowly about the weather. "Thank you for coming," Madame Vernou said, leading him into a sitting room at the front. The curtains were half drawn, muting what little light the day offered. A small coal fire burned in the grate, more for comfort than heat. She gestured for him to sit. Maigret lowered himself into a firm armchair that gave slightly under his weight. He filled his pipe again without hurry, his silence inviting her to speak. "It is difficult to explain," she began, folding her hands in her lap. Her fingers were restless, worrying at the edge of her handkerchief. "Perhaps I am foolish, but something has disturbed me. It has disturbed me for several days now, and I find I cannot put it from my mind." She hesitated, glancing toward the curtained window as if expecting someone might be standing beyond it. "You noticed the garden gate?" "Yes," Maigret said simply. "It has always been open. For as long as I have lived here, 12 years now, the gate has never been locked. We hardly use the garden except in summer, and even then it is small, nothing more than a place to sit. But last week," her voice faltered, "last week I found it locked, and I cannot say by whom. My husband insists he did not do it, and I believe him. We are the only 2 in this house. The key to that lock is not ours." Maigret let out a soft breath of smoke. He watched her, not her words, but the way she spoke them, the flick of her eyes to the window, the tightness around her mouth. "And you are troubled because the lock remains. Because the lock—" "Yes, each day it is there. I do not dare remove it, for what if someone placed it with intent? My husband laughs at me. He says it is some neighbor's foolish prank, but it does not feel so to me." The fire popped. Rain trickled against the window pane. "Have you spoken to your neighbors?" Maigret asked. "No, we are not on intimate terms. They would find me silly. And yet—" She pressed the handkerchief against her lips. "And yet 2 nights ago I thought I heard footsteps in the garden. Very late, past midnight. I went to the window, but it was too dark to see clearly. Only a shadow near the lilacs. When I mentioned it to my husband, he told me it was a dream." Maigret did not answer at once. He sat, pipe in hand, his heavy features unreadable, his gaze not fixed on her but on the faint reflection of the fire in the window. Silence thickened the room until the woman shifted uneasily. At length he asked, "Your husband is at home?" "No." "He is at his office. He works at the insurance company on Boulevard Saint-Michel. And the garden has no other entrance?" "None. Only the gate. And yet I am sure someone was there. I am sure of it." The words trembled not with hysteria but with an odd certainty, the conviction of someone who doubted herself yet clung stubbornly to what she felt. Maigret rose, heavy and deliberate, and asked if he might see the back of the house. She led him through a narrow corridor to a kitchen, small and tidy, from which a door opened onto a tiny yard. Here too was a wall, higher than the front hedge, impossible to scale without noise or difficulty. The rain had darkened the paving stones, no trace of footprints. He lingered there a while, staring at the walls, the wet leaves clinging to the stone, the stillness of the place. Madame Vernou stood beside him, her breath quickened, as if afraid that even here someone might appear. When? They returned to the sitting room. Maigret did not sit again. He placed his hat back on his head, shook her hand with unexpected gentleness, and said, "I shall think about it." Her face fell slightly, as though she had hoped for more immediate reassurance, but that was never his way. He left her there in the dim firelight and stepped once more into the drizzle. On the pavement he paused, lighting his pipe beneath the shelter of his cupped hands. The locked garden gate, the woman's fear, the husband who laughed, such things did not make a case, not yet, and yet Maigret knew that something had begun, quietly, like a thread barely tugged. It was not the lock that troubled him, nor the supposed footsteps, but the expression in Madame Vernou's eyes when she spoke of them. He walked slowly down the street, collar up against the rain, thinking not of evidence, but of that unease, which lingered, stubborn as the drizzle itself. Something he knew would draw him back. The drizzle did not let up as Maigret made his way back toward the cab stand. Drops gathered at the brim of his hat and slid down, darkening the shoulders of his coat. He felt the familiar dampness seeping into him, not unpleasant, merely inevitable, as much a part of Paris as the cobblestones beneath his feet. He walked slowly, pipe in hand, replaying Madame Vernou's words in his mind. It was not the locked gate itself that stayed with him, but the tone in which she had spoken, the uncertainty mixed with conviction, the way she had searched his face as though for permission to believe her own fears. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the atmosphere of the office had not changed. Files lay stacked in orderly disarray, clerks passed with quiet efficiency, and young Lapointe was bent over a report, his pen scratching rapidly across the page. He looked up as Maigret entered, expectant, but the inspector said nothing at first. He hung his coat, shook the moisture from his hat, and sat heavily at his desk. Only then did he reach for the telephone directory. "Insurance Company, Boulevard Saint-Michel," he murmured, almost to himself. His thick finger traced the names until he found what he was looking for. Vernou, Albert, departmental manager. He underlined it with his thumb and leaned back, smoke curling slowly from his pipe. Lapointe, sensing something, asked, "A case, Chief?" "Not a case," Maigret replied after a pause. "Not yet. Tell me, Lapointe, if your wife said she heard footsteps in the garden at night, would you believe her?" Lapointe blinked, puzzled, then gave a half-smile. "If it were my wife, perhaps not." Maigret did not return the smile. He puffed at his pipe, eyes half-closed, and said nothing more. That afternoon he walked, as was his habit, toward Boulevard Saint-Michel. The rain had eased into a fine mist that made the air taste metallic. The boulevard was busy despite the weather, students in worn coats hurrying between lectures, clerks and shopgirls with umbrellas dodging puddles. He found the insurance office in a grey stone building, its glass doors polished to a dull gleam. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ink, paper, and damp wool. Maigret asked at the reception for Monsieur Vernou. The young woman at the desk hesitated, eyeing his heavy frame, then disappeared into the warren of offices. A moment later, a man emerged, slight and precise, his suit well cut, though his tie was knotted too tightly. He was about 55, with thinning hair slicked back, spectacles that caught the light, and a certain stiffness that seemed less from pride than from habit. "I am Albert Vernou," he said, offering his hand without warmth. "Maigret." "Police." "Judiciaire." The other man's brows lifted slightly. "Is something the matter?" "No. I happened to be in the neighborhood," Maigret said, his tone deliberately neutral. "I met your wife this morning. She seemed concerned about your garden gate." For an instant Vernou's mouth twitched as though suppressing amusement. "Ah, yes. My wife's little fantasy. I assure you, Inspector, there is nothing unusual. Someone, a boy perhaps, put a padlock there as a prank. It is nothing to trouble the police about." "And the footsteps she says she heard?" Vernou gave a short laugh. My wife is a nervous woman. Too much time alone in that house, you understand. She invents noises. I work long hours. She has little else to occupy her mind. Maigret studied him silently, letting the pause lengthen. Most men under such silence betrayed something. Irritation, unease, a hint of impatience, but Vernou merely adjusted his tie and gazed back, his composure intact, though his eyes behind the spectacles remained curiously blank. "You haven't locked the gate yourself?" Maigret asked finally. "Of course not. Why should I? It is a ridiculous little patch of earth, nothing worth locking. And the key to that padlock does not belong to me. Whoever placed it there must be laughing at my wife's alarm." The inspector nodded slowly. He thanked the man, shook his hand again, and left. Yet as he stepped back into the damp air of the Boulevard, he felt no more satisfied than before. Vernou had been too quick, too certain in his dismissal. A husband might laugh at his wife's nerves, but the ease with which he explained them away seemed rehearsed, almost mechanical. That evening, over dinner, Madame Maigret served a stew that filled the kitchen with warmth. She listened without comment as her husband spoke of the day in fragments, never the whole. When he mentioned the locked gate, she stirred her spoon thoughtfully. "A locked gate to keep someone out, or to keep something in?" she said. He looked at her across the table, pipe resting beside his plate, and gave a small grunt of acknowledgement. She never pressed. She said such things as one might remark on the weather, leaving them to ripen in his mind. After supper, Maigret sat by the window with a glass of beer, watching the rain glisten on the pavement below. The quiet of the apartment was deep, punctuated only by the occasional clatter from the kitchen where his wife tidied. He thought of Madame Vernou, her restless hands, her searching eyes. He thought of the padlock, so new against the old iron gate. And he thought of Albert Vernou, tidy, composed, with eyes that revealed nothing. The following morning he returned to Parc Montsouris. The drizzle had passed, leaving the streets washed and pale under a grey sky. He stood once more before number 18. The padlock still hung on the gate, brass bright against the black iron. This time he leaned closer, examining it without touching. There were faint scratches around the hasp, as though someone had fumbled with it repeatedly. And the gravel within the garden, still undisturbed, no footprints. He remained there longer than was necessary, a tall figure in a heavy coat, pipe smoke curling around his head. A woman passed with a shopping basket and glanced at him curiously, then hurried on. Across the street a curtain stirred and fell back again. Maigret felt the weight of the neighborhood silence pressing on him. Respectable, ordinary, the kind of silence that concealed more than it revealed. And somewhere behind that silence, he knew a truth waited, patient, persistent, like the damp that crept inevitably into stone. When he finally turned away, it was not with the sense of leaving but of beginning. The locked garden gate was no prank. It was a message. The question was for whom? Maigret did not walk far from number 18 before stopping in a café at the corner, one of those places where the mirrors behind the counter had dulled with age, and the zinc bar was stained by years of elbows and spilled wine. He ordered a calvados, removed his hat, and sat with his broad hands resting on the table. From the window he could still glimpse the Vernou house, pale shutters closed, the locked gate faintly visible between the dripping lilac branches. The calvados warmed him, but his thoughts remained cool, measured. A locked gate, a woman's unease, a husband's dismissal, nothing that would justify the time of the police judiciaire. Yet here he was, watching, waiting, as though for the weather to change. It was not the facts that held him, it was the atmosphere. And atmosphere was never nothing. After a while he paid, put his hat back on, and walked slowly along the street. He noted the neighboring houses. At number 16, curtains twitched again as he passed. A pair of elderly eyes had been watching him earlier too. He stopped deliberately, turning his heavy frame toward the gate. This time, a thin woman, grey hair, pinned tightly, pushed the curtain aside and after a hesitation opened the door. She stepped out, wrapped in a black shawl, and looked him up and down. "You are a policeman?" she asked, voice sharp but not unfriendly. Maigret inclined his head. "Chief Inspector, yes, I was speaking with Madame Vernou yesterday," the woman sniffed. Ah, that poor soul, always worrying. You know her well as anyone knows a neighbor one greets at the market. We exchange a word. Nothing more, she is lonely. Her husband leaves early, comes back late. She makes things larger than they are. Such as a padlock on a gate? Maigret asked. The neighbor's lips tightened. She told you that? She shook her head. If it comforts her to imagine mysteries, I do not interfere. But it is true, Inspector. Someone has been about at night. I hear them too. Footsteps. Soft, but I hear, not dreams. Her eyes narrowed as if she had already said too much. She pulled the shawl closer around her shoulders. Have you seen anyone? Maigret pressed. Once, at the corner, I thought a man stood smoking under the lamplight. But when I looked again, he was gone. I am old, perhaps my eyes deceive me. You should ask the concierge of number 20. He sees more than anyone. With that, she retreated, closing the door firmly. Maigret stood there a moment longer, pipe between. His teeth. The drizzle had returned, tapping faintly on his hat brim. He walked on to number 20, a taller building with rented flats. The concierge, a stout man in a frayed waistcoat, looked at him with suspicion until Maigret showed his card. Have you noticed anyone near the Vernou house at night? The concierge shrugged. People come and go. Young ones from the university. They cut through the street. But sometimes, yes, I see a man there, not one of the neighbors. A fellow who smokes, loiters. Tall, perhaps, though he keeps to the shadows. Once I saw him rattle the garden gate as if trying it. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then I think he has returned, though always late, always quiet. Could you describe him? The concierge scratched his head. Dark coat, hat, nothing more. In the night one sees little. That was all, and yet it was enough to confirm what Madame Vernou had felt in her bones. Someone had been there. Someone who had locked the gate afterward, as if to leave a mark of their presence. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat with these fragments spread in his mind, like scattered pieces of a puzzle. He called for Lapointe. Young man, take a walk this evening. Parc Montsouris, Rue du Général de Mauduit, number 18. Watch the house discreetly. See if our friend with the cigarettes appears again. Lapointe's eyes lit with eagerness. He nodded briskly and went off to prepare. For himself, Maigret waited. He never hurried. The waiting was part of his work, part of his way of entering the rhythm of those he watched. He spent the afternoon at his desk, eyes half closed, pipe smoke drifting, while colleagues bustled with routine matters around him. When evening came, he dined at home, unhurried as always. Madame Maigret served a simple meal, and they spoke. Of small things. The fishmonger's new apprentice, a cousin who had written from Alsace. Yet beneath the ordinary talk, Maigret felt the slow pull of the case. His wife must have sensed it too, for when he rose to put on his coat, she said only, "You'll take another of your walks." He kissed her cheek and left. The night air was cooler, the rain gone, though the street still glistened under the lamps. He walked slowly, heavily toward Parc Montsouris, blending into the shadows like any passerby. He found Lapointe waiting across from number 18, collar turned up, hands deep in his pockets. "Anything?" Maigret asked. "Nothing yet, Chief. It's quiet." Then we wait. They stood there together, silent, the minutes stretching. A tram clattered in the distance, footsteps echoed and faded. Midnight passed. Then, at last, a faint glow appeared at the corner, the flare of a match. A figure stood beneath the lamppost, tall, shoulders hunched, the ember of a cigarette glowing briefly before dimming. Maigret did not move. He let the man smoke, flick away the butt, light another. The stranger lingered, staring toward number 18. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until he reached the locked gate. He placed a hand on it, rattled it once, lightly as if in testing. After a pause, he turned and walked off into the night, coat swinging slightly with his stride. Lapointe looked at Maigret, eager for instruction, but Maigret shook his head. "Not tonight. Let him think himself unseen. Tomorrow, perhaps, we will learn more." As they walked away, Maigret felt the unease deepen in him. The padlock was no prank. The footsteps were no dream. Someone was circling the Vernou house, returning again and again like a moth to a lamp. And the question pressed heavier with each step. What was it about that modest little house with its locked garden gate that drew such persistence? The night gave no answer. Only the silence of the damp streets and the quiet certainty that the truth was waiting, patient as always behind the ordinary facades of Paris. The following morning, Maigret was at his office earlier than usual. The drizzle had returned, blurring the quay and muffling the traffic on the Pont Saint-Michel. He sat behind his desk, heavy hands resting on the blotter, the smell of damp wool rising from his coat. Lapointe came in shortly afterward, his eyes still bright from the long watch. "He was there again, Chief," the young inspector reported. "Just as you saw, he stood by the gate, smoked, rattled it once. Then he left. I followed him as far as the tram stop. He took the line toward Denfert-Rochereau. I didn't press too close." "You did well," Maigret said, his tone even. He drew smoke from his pipe and let it drift slowly upward. "We'll not scare him away too soon. A man who returns to the same place night after night will return again. When the time is right, he'll give us more than his shadow." The day stretched uneventfully. Routine cases passed across his desk, none deserving his attention. Yet the thought of the locked gate persisted. What troubled him most was not the intruder himself, but the curious mixture of indifference and denial in Albert Vernoux. A husband who dismissed his wife's fears so completely without even irritation was a man either remarkably detached or remarkably practiced at concealing his own unease. In the afternoon, Maigret took a walk down Boulevard Saint-Michel and entered the insurance offices again. Vernoux was there, neat as before, spectacles gleaming under the electric lights. He rose politely when he saw Maigret and led him into a private room lined with filing cabinets. "You again, Inspector?" Vernoux said, not unkindly, but with the strained smile of a man tolerating a guest who stayed too long. Maigret lit his pipe before answering. "Your wife is still anxious. Someone has indeed been in the street at night. A man who smokes under the lamppost rattles the gate." Vernoux gave a little shake of his head. "Students, loiterers. Paris is full of such shadows." "Not students," Maigret said quietly. "A man who returns deliberately. Always to the same place. Always to your house." For the first time, Vernoux's eyes flickered. It was no more than a second, a slight tightening of the lids, but Maigret caught it. The man's composure settled quickly again, but something had cracked. "I cannot explain what others do," Vernoux replied evenly. "But I can assure you, Inspector, it has nothing to do with me. My wife is impressionable. I would prefer she not be encouraged in her fancies." "You're certain you have no idea who might take such an interest?" "None whatsoever." They parted without hostility, but as Maigret stepped back into the misty air, he felt the weight of that flicker in the man's gaze. It was not the fear of being accused, rather the fear of recognition, as though some memory had brushed against him too sharply. That evening Maigret did not send Lapointe alone. He himself returned to Parc Montsouris. They stood in their accustomed place, the inspector broad and still, the young man alert beside him. The lamps glowed faintly in the damp, their halos blurred by the mist. Time passed with the slow weight of waiting. At 11:30, the familiar match flared. The man was there again, tall, shoulders hunched, a figure made anonymous by hat and coat. He smoked, moved closer, and stood before the gate. This time he did not merely rattle it. He leaned forward, placed both hands on the iron, and stayed. There a long moment, as though listening to something beyond the lilacs, beyond the gravel path. Then he stepped back, pulled his collar up and walked swiftly away. Maigret touched Lapointe's arm. "Follow, but carefully." The young inspector slipped into the shadows. Maigret remained, pipe glowing faintly, his breath steady in the night air. He waited, as he always did, until the silence returned. Only when he saw Lapointe reappear some 20 minutes later did he stir. He went into a café near the station, Lapointe reported. Sat there alone. 2 glasses of beer, no one spoke to him. Then he left, took a tram toward Montrouge. "I lost him after that. Did you see his face?" "Not clearly, he kept it low, but he is not young, Chief, perhaps 40, 45. Maigret grunted. "We'll see him again. He cannot resist it." The following day he decided on a different approach. He returned to the Vernoux house, this time in daylight, and asked to speak again with Madame Vernoux. She welcomed him into the sitting room, her nervousness still apparent. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her cardigan as she spoke. "You believe me now, Inspector? You believe someone comes to the gate?" "Yes, madame, I have seen him myself." She shivered, drawing her shoulders inward. "But why? What could he want with us?" "Perhaps not with you," Maigret said gently. "Perhaps with your husband." Her eyes widened. "Albert? But who would—" "He is so ordinary, so careful. His life is only his work, our quiet dinners, the occasional walk. We have no enemies." Maigret did not contradict her. He let her words hang in the dim room, smoke rising between them. After a pause, he asked, "Your husband never speaks of his past? Of friends from before your marriage?" She frowned, searching her memory. "Rarely. He is not a man of confidences. We married late. He was 40 then. His youth is a closed book. He only ever says it was dull, provincial. He was born in Angoulême. His parents are gone. We never visit. He does not speak of it." That silence, Maigret thought, was telling in itself. Most men, when they spoke of their origins, offered small details: the street of their childhood, a teacher they hated, the river where they swam. But a man who described his past only as dull, who erased it with a single word, was often a man who wished it forgotten. When he left the Vernou house, the drizzle had lifted at last, leaving the streets slick and shining under a pale afternoon sky. Maigret paused on the pavement, pipe unlit, considering the garden gate with its stubborn padlock, a gate that had become the silent stage for someone's nocturnal ritual. He turned up his collar and began to walk slowly back toward the tram line. The investigation had not yet revealed its shape, but the threads were drawing closer. A man in the shadows, a wife uneasy, a husband evasive. Somewhere among them was the key, not to the lock on the gate, but to the hidden chamber of truth behind it. And Maigret, patient as always, would wait until that chamber opened by itself, the by. Next morning the air was heavy and still, a rare pause between rains. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres with his usual measured step, greeted the duty officer with a nod, and went straight to his office. The case reports waiting on his desk he pushed aside without opening. His mind was on the Vernou house, the padlock, and the man in the shadows. He tamped his pipe and sat back, staring at the smoke curling upward. It was not evidence he needed now, but history. If Albert Vernou was a man who had buried his past, then somewhere there would be records of it. And records, unlike men, did not conceal themselves so easily. He telephoned the municipal office at Angoulême. His voice was calm, courteous, but firm. He requested copies of birth records, school registers, employment papers, anything on Albert Vernou, son of a notary's clerk, born 55 years ago. The clerk promised to send what they had by the end of the week. Maigret thanked him, hung up and sat quietly, letting the silence press close. He had no doubt that the past would begin to seep through the cracks soon enough. By late morning, Lapointe entered, hair still damp from the mist outside. "I went back to the café, near the station, Chief, the one where our man stopped after visiting the gate. The owner remembered him. Comes in twice a week, always alone, always 2 beers. He pays in small change, doesn't talk. Keeps his hat on. They don't know his name." "Did he say anything at all?" Lapointe thought. "Once he asked what time the last tram left, that's all. It wasn't much, but it was something. A man who lingered in silence, drinking without conversation, carrying himself like a shadow, and yet drawn irresistibly to a particular house on a quiet street." In the afternoon, Maigret took another slow walk to the Parc Montsouris quarter. The clouds were darker now, and the smell of wet leaves hung in the air. At number 18, the shutters remained closed, the padlock gleaming. He did not go in this time. Instead, he lingered across the street, leaning heavily against a lamp-post, filling his pipe, watching the comings and goings of the neighborhood. At number 16, the grey-haired neighbor with the shawl appeared again, broom in hand, sweeping damp leaves from her steps. She paused, gave him a shrewd look and said, "Back again, Inspector, still chasing shadows?" "Sometimes shadows are more revealing than faces," Maigret replied. She snorted, half amused. "Well, if you're waiting for your smoker, he won't come by daylight, only after dark, like a cat." Maigret inclined his head but did not answer. He stayed there until the lamps flickered on and the air thickened with drizzle once more. That evening he returned home for supper. Madame Maigret served a pot-au-feu, her steady presence filling the kitchen with warmth. As always, she listened without comment as he spoke of the day's fragments. When he mentioned the man at the café, she raised her eyebrows slightly. "A man who drinks alone, who looks at a house but never enters," she said. "He reminds me of the boys who used to pass our garden in Alsace when I was a girl. They would never knock, never speak, just look through the hedge and walk on. They were too timid to declare themselves." Her remark, spoken lightly, lodged itself in his thoughts. A timid suitor, a man watching a woman he could not approach. But the Vernou couple had been married for over a decade, unless the interest was older still, unless it was not Madame Vernou who drew the man, but something, or someone from before. Later that night, long after his wife had gone to bed, Maigret sat at the kitchen table with a glass of beer. He replayed Madame Vernou's words. Her husband never spoke of his youth, never mentioned friends or family. A closed book. And now, a stranger haunting their gate, silent, persistent, unwilling to go away. The two threads pulled toward each other. The next day, Maigret visited the prefecture archives. With the help of a weary clerk, he combed through employment registers from Angoulême. Vernou had worked briefly at a local bank before moving to Paris. Before that, he had attended a lycée, then vanished from the records for nearly 2 years. When he reappeared, it was with a different occupation, a different address, as if something had been quietly erased. Maigret closed the file slowly, the pieces turning in his mind. A gap in a man's life was rarely meaningless. It was in those blank spaces that the shadows gathered. Returning to the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Lapointe waiting. "He was at the café again today, Chief. The man from the gate. This time, I got a better look. He has a scar on his cheek just here." He touched his own face near the jaw. "And he limps slightly, the right leg." Maigret listened in silence, pipe smoke drifting. A scar, a limp. These were not the marks of a dreamer. This was a man who carried his past on his skin. That evening the weather turned colder. A fine rain slicked the cobbles, reflecting the yellow lamps in trembling pools. Maigret returned once more to the street near Parc Montsouris. He stood, with Lapointe waiting in the shadows. Midnight approached. At last the match flared. The man was there again, taller in the mist, the scar catching the light for an instant. He smoked, staring at the gate, then leaned heavily on it with both hands. This time Maigret crossed the street. His footsteps were steady, unhurried. The man looked up, startled, but did not flee. His eyes, dark beneath the brim of his hat, held a weary defiance. The inspector stopped a pace away, pipe glowing faintly. "You come here often," Maigret said quietly. The man's jaw tightened. He did not answer. "Why this house?" Still silence. Only the sound of the rain on the hedge, the faint hiss of the street lamp. Maigret let the pause stretch. He knew silence was often more effective than questions. At last, the man exhaled smoke, turned slightly and muttered, "Because I have a right to." The words hung between them, heavy and ambiguous. Before Maigret could press further, the man dropped his cigarette, ground it underfoot and walked off into the mist, his limp more visible now. Lapointe moved as if to follow, but Maigret raised a hand. "Let him go." They watched until the figure disappeared into the night. Maigret stood there a while longer, pipe in hand, rain dripping steadily from the brim of his hat. A right to. The words carried more weight than a denial, more substance than a confession. Somewhere in them lay the link between the locked gate, the evasive husband, and the man in the shadows. The night closed in again, damp and heavy, but Maigret knew the silence was beginning to give way. The truth was near. It would not be long before it revealed itself. The following morning the rain had not ceased, though it fell more softly, a misting drizzle that blurred the outlines of buildings and gave the city a muffled calm. Maigret left his apartment later than usual, after a second cup of coffee, his mind returning again and again to the words the stranger had spoken. "I have a right to." It was neither the plea of a beggar nor the boast of a fool. It was quiet, stubborn and deeply personal. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the mail from Angoulême had arrived. Among the official papers was a letter from the municipal clerk. It confirmed what Maigret already suspected. During the 2 missing years of Albert Vernoux's life, there were no records at all. Not of residence, not of employment, not even of taxation. A man had been erased and then reappeared, apparently, respectable with nothing to link the gap. He studied the dry sheets of paper while his pipe cooled. Somewhere in the silence of those 2 years lived the reason for the stranger's visits. He wondered if Madame Vernoux, who had spoken of her husband's silence with resignation, knew more than she admitted, or if she had long since given up, asking. By mid-morning he sent Lapointe again to the café near the station. This time the young inspector was to wait, to watch, and if possible to follow. Meanwhile Maigret returned once more to the street near Parc Montsouris, the drizzle settling into the collar of his coat. The old neighbour with the shawl saw him coming and leaned against her broom, clearly pleased at the sight of him. "He was here again last night," she announced, as if she had been waiting for the chance to report. "I didn't see you, so I thought perhaps you'd given up." "I was here," Maigret said. "And I spoke with him." Her eyes gleamed. "Did he tell you his name?" "No. But he said he had a right to stand at that gate." The woman pursed her lips, shook her head, and muttered something about people carrying old grudges to the grave. Maigret let her words sink in, though he did not show any reaction. He had learned long ago that gossip, even when embroidered, carried the faint outlines of truth. In the afternoon, Lapointe returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. His boots squeaked as he came into Maigret's office, rain still dripping from his coat. "I followed him, Chief. He left the café and took the tram to Belleville. He lives in a small boarding house there, Rue de Tourty. The concierge says his name is Joseph Lambert. Been there 6 months, pays on time, never trouble. He works, she thinks, at a warehouse near the canal." Maigret made no notes, simply leaned back in his chair. "Did she say where he came from?" "Before?" "No. Only that he arrived with a small suitcase and asked no questions. Joseph Lambert, a name as ordinary as bread, perhaps chosen for its anonymity. A warehouse worker, limping, with a scar on his face, nursing beer in silence, and haunting a gate he would not enter." Maigret's eyes lingered on the curls of smoke rising from his pipe. It was not the portrait of a madman. It was the portrait of someone tethered to a memory he could not abandon. That evening, Maigret himself went to Belleville. The streets were narrow and alive with dripping gutters, children darting under umbrellas, shopkeepers pulling in their awnings against the drizzle. The Rue de Tourty was crowded with shabby houses, laundry sagging on lines even in the damp air. He found the boarding house without asking. Its plaster was cracked, the entrance narrow, the smell of cabbage and coal clinging to the stairwell. The concierge was a stout woman with sharp eyes and flour on her apron. She confirmed what Lapointe had reported. Lambert kept to himself, paid promptly, and asked for little. "He eats in his room, mostly bread and sausage, doesn't bring anyone in. He goes out in the evening sometimes, comes back late. Always. Polite, though. Has he ever mentioned Angoulême?" Maigret asked. She blinked. "Angoulême? No, never. Is that where he's from?" Maigret did not answer. He left his card with her and stepped back into the wet street. A light glowed faintly in the first-floor window of the house. He did not look up at it directly, but his mind began weaving the threads together. A missing 2 years, a man who suddenly re-emerges with a respectable life, another man, scarred and limping, who claims a right to the house where he now lives. It was too early to confront either man. The truth was still hidden behind layers of silence, and to push too soon would only scatter the pieces further. Maigret's strength was patience, and he let it steady him now. The next morning, Madame Vernoux herself telephoned the Quai des Orfèvres. Her voice, soft but strained, asked if the inspector might come again. Her husband had returned late the night before, more distant than usual, and she felt uneasy. Maigret arrived at number 18 under a low grey sky. Madame Vernoux received him in the parlour, her hands twisting together as she spoke. "I don't know what you've discovered, Inspector, but my husband is not the man I thought he was. For years I told myself he was simply reserved, that his silence meant nothing. But lately it is as if someone is standing at his shoulder and he fears to turn around." Her words echoed Maigret's own thoughts. He asked quietly, "Did he mention a man named Lambert?" Her eyes flickered with something like recognition, though she shook her head quickly. "No, never." Yet her hesitation was enough. She knew the name, or at least it stirred something she had heard long ago. As Maigret left the house, rain beginning again in soft, persistent drops, he paused at the gate, resting his hand on the cold iron. Somewhere in the overlapping lives of Albert Vernoux and Joseph Lambert lay a story of silence, of erasure, of a claim unspoken for too many years. He felt the weight of it pressing closer, like the damp air itself. For now, he would wait. He would let the silence work a little longer, until one of the two men, Albert Vernoux with his closed shutters, or Joseph Lambert with his nightly vigil, could bear it no more. And when the silence finally broke, the truth would step quietly out of the shadows. The rain had thickened into a steady curtain by the time Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. His overcoat was heavy with damp, his felt hat dripping as he set it on the rack. In his office, the pipe smoke hung low, mingling with the scent of wet wool. He sat at his desk and let the silence gather around him, that silence he so often used as a tool, letting thoughts and half-formed suspicions settle into place. Albert Vernoux, a man with 2 missing years in his past. Joseph Lambert, limping, scarred, staking a nightly claim before a locked gate. And between them, a woman who twisted her hands as she spoke, her voice colored with unease, but reluctant to betray her husband outright. The pieces lay scattered, yet each was weighted with something heavy, something that pointed not to crime in the usual sense, but to a wound left unhealed. In the evening, Lapointe came with his usual restless energy. He had been to the warehouse, near the canal, asking discreet questions about Lambert. The men there described him as diligent, but withdrawn, the sort who arrived early, left late, and spoke little. "They don't know much about him, Chief. Some think he's from the south, others say he worked on the docks before. He never corrects them, just shrugs. And his limp. They say it comes from the war, shrapnel in the leg. He doesn't talk about it, but they've noticed how he stiffens in the cold." Maigret puffed slowly, his eyes half closed. The war. Of course. The missing years of Albert Vernoux coincided too neatly with the last stretch of the Great War, when men disappeared, into mud and returned, if at all, carrying scars that never healed. Perhaps the silence of one man and the obsession of another both began in those same years, in the same trench under the same rain. The thought lingered, heavy and inevitable. He asked Lapointe to fetch him the war records from the ministry. Lapointe hesitated. Such files were slow to come, often incomplete. But Maigret insisted, "It is not the kind of thing that can be hurried, Lapointe, but it must be done, quietly." The following afternoon, Maigret returned once more to the Rue de Tourtille. He stood across the street from the boarding house where Lambert lived, a small figure behind the curtain briefly appearing, then fading again. The drizzle clung to the windows, distorting the shapes inside. He did not go in. He had no wish to corner the man too soon. Instead, he lingered, walking slowly up and down the street as though waiting for someone who never came. It was on his way back that he noticed a small detail, one of those ordinary fragments others might dismiss. In a café near the corner, a newspaper lay abandoned on a table. On its front page was a short notice of veterans from Angoulême meeting in Paris for their annual commemoration. The date matched the very evening when Lambert had lingered longest, at the Vernoux gate. Coincidence, perhaps, but Maigret did not believe in coincidences when men's lives intertwined so closely. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he found the beginnings of a file on Albert Vernoux. The notary's son had indeed enlisted in 1917 at the age of 27, wounded in the leg, hospitalized, then discharged with honors. But the hospital record was curiously brief, omitting the names of the men in his regiment, the details of his injury. And though he had returned to Angoulême for a short time afterward, he had soon moved to Paris, cutting ties with his old acquaintances. The next evening, Maigret went again to number 18, this time later than usual. He asked Madame Vernoux if he might speak with her husband. She hesitated, but led him into a narrow study at the back of the house. Albert Vernou was seated at a desk, spectacles perched on his nose, a ledger open before him, though his pen lay idle. His face was pale, drawn, and his eyes flickered nervously. When they met Maigret's, "You've been looking into my past," Vernou said before Maigret had spoken a word. His voice was flat, weary. Maigret merely inclined his head, filled his pipe with deliberate slowness, and said, "Your past is not entirely clear, Monsieur Vernou. 2 years are missing. People notice such things." The man's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his pen, only to set it down again. "There is nothing to say about those years. They belong to another life." "Perhaps. But others have not forgotten them." Vernou's eyes lifted sharply, fear flashing across them before he quickly lowered his gaze. "Who told you that?" Maigret let the silence stretch, the kind that pressed down until words spilled out. At last Vernou muttered, "If it is Lambert, you mean he has no right to trouble me, no right at all." The echo of the same phrase struck Maigret like a soft hammer. A right, spoken by both men, each in his own way, both with bitterness. Stood, thanked Vernou with a curt nod, and took his leave without pushing further. He had what he needed, confirmation that the two men's lives were entwined, though how and why remained clouded. As he stepped out into the rain, Madame Vernou watched him from the doorway, her eyes full of questions she dared not ask. He touched his hat politely and walked on, his heavy figure swallowed by the drizzle. That night he sat in his kitchen once more, the warm smell of soup drifting from the stove where Madame Maigret worked quietly. He said little, only that the matter was not yet ready to be resolved, but his wife, with the instinct of one who had long shared his silences, said softly, "It is always the same with these men. The war never ends for them. It ends on paper, perhaps, but not in their hearts." He looked at her, the pipe heavy in his hand, and thought of Lambert leaning against the gate in the rain, of Vernou in his shuttered study, of two men carrying the same burden but naming it differently. The war had carved itself into their flesh and memory, and now, years later, it was pressing at the locked gate of a quiet Parisian house. For the first time, Maigret felt the outline of the truth take shape. Not the whole of it yet, but enough to know that the silence would not last much longer. The rain, steady and relentless, seemed to whisper that soon the gate would open, not by force, but by the weight of memory too long ignored. The rain had thinned by morning, but Paris seemed no brighter for it. The streets glistened under a dim sky, puddles reflecting the dull yellow of street lamps that had not yet been extinguished. Maigret walked slowly to the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe clenched in his teeth, his hat brim dripping. His thoughts returned, again and again, to that word, spoken by both men in different tones, almost as if rehearsed over the years. A right. Whatever lay buried in the years of war, it bound them with a claim neither could relinquish. On his desk, a slim folder waited. Delivered during the night. The ministry had sent preliminary war records. Maigret lit his pipe, turned the pages one by one, and felt the pattern confirm itself. Joseph Lambert, conscripted in 1917, assigned to the same regiment as Albert Vernou. Both served in the Argonne sector, the final months of the war when the lines were mud and wire, when men disappeared into shell craters never to return. Vernou was listed as wounded, hospitalized after an incident in late 1918. Lambert had been marked as missing for nearly 3 months, later reappearing with injuries consistent with captivity. 2 men, same regiment, same front, same silence. Afterward, Lapointe arrived as Maigret was rereading the pages. His hair was still damp from the drizzle, his expression eager. "I've kept an eye on Lambert, Chief. He hasn't been near the gate since the night you spoke with him. But last night he was seen in a bar near Belleville, very drunk. He told the barman he had fought at Argonne, that he had seen things no one believed. He said the name Vernou too. The barman thought it was a curse." Maigret's pipe smoke curled slowly upward. The confirmation was there. The missing years in Vernou's life were not silent years of exile, but of survival, perhaps at Lambert's expense, perhaps bound up in a decision made in mud and terror. The war had planted the seed of the present tension. By late afternoon, Maigret returned to Parc Montsouris. The clouds hung low, the gardens sodden, the hedges glistening. He did not approach the house directly, but stood again under the street lamp, opposite the gate. It was not long before the old woman with the shawl appeared, broom in hand. "He hasn't come," she said, her tone almost disappointed. "The scarred one. It's been 2 nights now. Perhaps he will return when the time is right," Maigret answered. She gave him a sharp glance, as if trying to measure how much he knew. "They always come back, Inspector. You'll see. Some gates don't stay locked forever." That evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Maigret received a telephone call. It was Madame Vernou, her voice strained, trembling. "He's here, the man, at the gate again. Albert refuses to go out. He is sitting in his study, and I think he is afraid. Can you come?" Within half an hour, Maigret's heavy figure was making its way through the damp, silent streets. The lamps shone on the slick pavement, and his pipe glowed faintly as he approached number 18. The gate stood as before, padlocked, but beyond it, leaning against the iron bars, was Joseph Lambert. His hat brim was wet, his coat plastered with rain, his limp more pronounced. He did not stir when Maigret came up beside him. Inside the house, a curtain shifted. A pale face appeared for a moment in the window, the face of Albert Vernou, rigid, transfixed. Then it vanished. Maigret said nothing at first. He simply stood with Lambert, the rain pattering against their shoulders. At last, he spoke quietly. "You've come back." Lambert's jaw tightened. He exhaled smoke, the cigarette trembling slightly in his fingers. "He hides behind those shutters. He thinks time erases everything, but time doesn't erase, it rots, it festers." "And you're right?" Maigret asked. Lambert turned his scarred face toward the inspector, his eyes glistening with something fiercer than anger. "My right is to be remembered. My right is to have the truth spoken aloud, not buried behind his fine clothes and locked gates." Through the window, Maigret saw a flicker of movement, the curtain shifting again. He did not turn toward it. Instead, he asked, "What happened in Argonne?" Lambert's breath caught. For a moment he said nothing, the silence filled only by the steady hiss of the rain. Then, in a low voice, he murmured, "He left me there. We were in the same hole when the shell hit. I was bleeding, my leg torn open. He could have dragged me back, but he saved himself. He ran. They found me later, half dead. Prisoners picked me up, patched me just enough to keep me breathing. Months before the armistice set me free." His words hung in the wet air, not shouted, not pleaded, simply released like smoke rising and vanishing into the rain. Inside the house, Maigret knew Vernou was listening. He could almost feel the man's presence at the shutter, frozen, unable to turn away. Maigret put his pipe out, slowly tapped it against the gate, and said, "These things don't belong to me, Lambert. They belong to you and to him. But sooner or later silence breaks. Either he will speak or you will force him to." Lambert dropped his cigarette, ground it into the wet pavement with his heel, and straightened despite his limp. "I don't want punishment. I want him to look me in the face and admit what he did, that is all." The man turned, his shoulders stooped, and limped away into the rain without another word. Maigret remained a long moment, pipe cold in his hand, then crossed the street and entered the house. Madame Vernou met him at the door, pale and trembling. "I heard him. All of it. Albert heard it too. He hasn't moved from his chair. In the study, Vernou sat as before, the ledger untouched, his spectacles lying crooked on the desk. His face was chalk-white, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the room. Maigret said nothing. He simply lowered himself into the armchair opposite, filled his pipe, and waited. The silence pressed on, minute after minute, the clock ticking. Faintly in the hall. At last Vernou's lips moved. "He exaggerates. It was chaos. You cannot know what it was like. A man thinks only of survival. I was wounded too. I thought he was dead." Maigret's gaze never wavered. He let the words fall into the silence, let them crumble under their own weight. Vernou's voice faltered, his hands trembling on the armrests. Then, almost inaudibly, he whispered, "But I knew he wasn't. I heard him call my name, and I ran. The confession was barely more than a breath, but it was enough. It carried the weight of years of silence, of a locked gate and shuttered windows. Maigret rose heavily, his pipe unlit in his hand. He did not speak. He left the man in his study, his wife in the parlour, and stepped once more into the rain. The street was empty now, the gate glistening, the night pressing close. The truth had begun to emerge, quiet and raw, not in shouts or accusations, but in whispers shaped by memory. The silence was breaking at last, and with it, the locked garden. Gate no longer seemed quite so impenetrable. The following morning, Maigret awoke with a heaviness that had little to do with the weather. The rain had finally ceased, but Paris still seemed weighed down, its streets washed clean but dull, its air thick with a silence of its own. He sat by the window for a time, pipe unlit, staring at the rooftops, considering what Lambert's accusation and Vernoux's broken whisper now meant. A truth had been spoken, but only in fragments, and Maigret knew well enough that fragments, left untended, could cut as sharply as whole confessions. At the office, he found Lapointe waiting with fresh notes. "Lambert has vanished again, Chief. He wasn't at his usual lodgings. The concierge said he packed a bag late last night. She heard him muttering that it was almost finished. She thought he meant drink, but I don't think so." Maigret exhaled slowly, lowering himself into his chair. "No, not drink, something else. He is tired of waiting at the gate. He wants closure." Lapointe hesitated, then added, "There's more. I checked on the wife this morning. Madame Vernoux was seen at the church on Rue des Plantes. She lit. A candle stayed longer than usual. The priest says she asked if the church ever forgives sins that are left unspoken." The inspector rubbed his broad forehead with the back of his hand. The truth, once stirred, never returned quietly to its slumber. Lambert was pressing forward with the weight of years behind him, and Madame Vernoux was already bending under. Tony Albert remained rigid, frozen in the denial of a man who had lived too long behind his shutters. That afternoon, Maigret returned once more to Parc Montsouris. The air was damp, heavy with the earthy scent of the soaked gardens. The gate stood as always, its padlock glinting faintly, but this time there was no figure leaning in the shadows, no hunched man with a limp and a scar. The street was empty, silent. Yet as Maigret approached, he noticed something small wedged between the bars, a scrap of folded paper soggy from the rain. He pulled it free, unfolded it carefully, and read the shaky handwriting. Only a few words were scrawled there, blurred by water but still legible. "He must come out, tonight, or I will make him." The note bore no signature, yet it hardly needed one. Inside the house, Madame Vernoux answered the door with an anxious face, her hands clutching her shawl as though it could shield her from more than the chill. Maigret showed her the note. She read it silently, lips pressed tight, eyes flickering toward the study door, where her husband once again sat buried in his papers. "He won't move," she whispered. "He sits there all day and night. He hasn't touched food. He smokes and stares and mutters. He says nothing of importance. He is diminished." "Lambert won't be satisfied with silence any longer," Maigret told her. "If your husband doesn't face him, there will be no peace, for either of them." Her eyes brimmed, but she gave no answer. Instead, she led Maigret into the study. Vernoux was there exactly as described, spectacles in place, a pen held limp in his fingers, though the paper before him remained blank. His skin looked drawn, almost grey. He glanced up as Maigret entered, but his gaze was hollow, drained of the stubborn pride that once kept him behind his shutters. "You read his note?" Maigret asked quietly. Vernoux gave the faintest nod. His lips parted, but the words failed to emerge. Only after a long moment did he manage, "He wants a trial, a public one. He wants me condemned." "No," Maigret said, seating himself heavily opposite. "He doesn't want a trial. He wants you to look him in the eye. That is all. Do that, and it will end. Refuse, and he will not stop. He will drag you into the open one way or another." The man's hands trembled on the desk. "I cannot. If I speak the words, if I admit them aloud—" He trailed off, shaking, his head as if the thought alone might unmake him. "You already did," Maigret reminded him softly. "Last night, to yourself, to me. You said you heard him call your name." The silence stretched thickly between them, broken only by the faint creak of the house and the ticking of the clock in the hall. Finally, Maigret rose. Tonight, he will come. I will be here, but the words must come from you. When night fell, the inspector returned. He sat quietly in the parlor with Madame Vernou, while the house remained cloaked in a stillness broken only by the occasional hiss of the fire. Outside, the garden lay in shadows, the lamplight glistening on wet leaves. Hours passed. Then, near midnight, a sound at the gate, a rattle of metal. Maigret rose and crossed to the window. Lambert was there, his figure dim, raincoat clinging to his frame, his hat pulled low. This time he carried no cigarette, no air of waiting. His hand gripped the iron bars, shaking them faintly as though he might wrench them apart. Maigret opened the door and stepped out into the damp night. The two men faced one another across the locked gate. Lambert's eyes burned in the darkness. "Well," he said hoarsely, "will he come?" Behind Maigret, footsteps creaked on the tiles. He did not turn. He knew who it was. Slowly, Albert Vernou appeared in the doorway, pale in the lamplight, his shoulders stooped, but his face set. He walked as if carrying a weight long denied, each step heavier than the last, until he stood beside Maigret at the gate. For a long moment, nothing passed between them but silence, the silence of decades, of war and shame and waiting. Then, with a voice low but clear, Vernou said, "I left you, I heard you call, and I ran. You lived, I lived, but I ran." The words fell like stones into the wet night. Lambert closed his eyes, his scarred face tightening. His hand slipped from the bars. He swayed slightly, then straightened. "That's all I ever wanted," he whispered. "To hear it." He turned then, without another word, and limped slowly into the darkness until the shadows swallowed him. Maigret and Vernou remained at the gate, the silence now different, no longer festering but drained, emptied. At last, Vernou sagged against the bars, his head bowed. Maigret touched his shoulder briefly, then turned back into the house, leaving him there in the damp night, alone with the weight he had carried so long. The truth had been spoken, the silence had broken. But Maigret knew well enough that the breaking of silence did not mean peace, only the beginning of it, and whether Lambert's release or Vernou's collapse would prove the truer ending remained to be seen. The following morning, the streets of Paris were washed clean, and a faint mist hung over the city, softening the edges of the buildings and the faces of those who moved about their daily business. Maigret walked slowly back to the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe unlit, his coat damp from the lingering drizzle. The city seemed quieter than usual, as if it too had paused to take in the resolution that had unfolded the night before. At the office, Lapointe was waiting with his habitual restlessness. "He left early, Chief. Lambert, no note, just gone. And Vernou, he's asleep in his study. For the first time in years, they say he didn't even light the lamp." Maigret nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly, not in amusement but in quiet satisfaction. They have both confronted the past, one with words, the other with patience. That was all that was needed. He sat at his desk, the weight of the last few days pressing into his shoulders, but lighter now than it had been. He reviewed the events, not as evidence in a case, but as moments of human truth. A scar, a limp, a locked gate, two men haunted by the same memory. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, yet enough to expose the frailties and courage that had lain beneath the surface for decades. He thought of Madame Vernou, who had watched silently from her doorway as the confrontation unfolded, and of the shadowed figures outside, who had carried burdens too heavy to articulate. The mystery had not been solved with cleverness or force, but by observation, patience, and the quiet insistence of truth. By late morning, he returned to number 18. Madame Vernou greeted him at the door, her expression subdued but relieved. "Albert is resting," she said softly. I think he will be different now, lighter somehow, and the man who came, he has gone. For good, I hope." Maigret inclined his head. "It is over for them. Not because of me, but because they were forced to face it themselves. That is how such matters are resolved, not by the law, but by acknowledgement." He lingered a moment, gazing at the wet garden, the padlock on the gate no longer a symbol of menace but of a past finally confronted. Even the rain had ceased entirely, leaving the air sharp and clean. Returning to his apartment, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sank into his chair, pipe lit, the smoke curling upward lazily. Across the street, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet triumphs and failures of its inhabitants. Yet in that ordinary Paris morning, Maigret felt the subtle relief of justice done, not the dramatic justice of headlines, but the quiet, necessary justice of human understanding. He sipped his coffee, exhaled smoke slowly, and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. People carried their pasts with them, sometimes like chains, sometimes like scars that others could never see. But in facing those pasts, in naming them at last, there was a release that was almost sacred. The locked garden gate, the man who limped, the husband who had hidden behind his shutters, all were resolved in the simplest and most profound of ways. By recognition, by confession, and by the weight of memory finally laid down. Maigret leaned back, hands resting on the arms of his chair, and let the city murmur around him. Outside, a tram rattled along its tracks, a child's laugh echoed from a courtyard, and the sun, hesitant but determined, broke through the mist. Life continued, ordinary and unremarkable, yet somehow brighter for the quiet truths revealed behind number 18. And in that calm, Maigret understood once again why he pursued the quiet paths of human observation, why he sought answers not in evidence, alone but in gestures, silences, and fleeting glances. The mystery had ended, not with a shout or an arrest, but with understanding, a slow-burning illumination that lingered long after the rain had passed. He set down his cup, tapped out the ash from his pipe, and allowed himself a moment of contented solitude. The world was unchanged, yet in the lives of 2 men and 1 woman, a burden had been lifted, and that for Maigret was enough. The locked garden gate remained, gleaming faintly in the morning sun, its secret finally known, its tension resolved. And for the first time in a long while, the streets of Paris seemed a little lighter, a little less burdened, carrying the ordinary and extraordinary weight of human lives onward, quietly, inexorably, as it always did.